Hello everyone, my name is Chekube Chukwumafo. I'm here to analyze the political economy of Nigeria using the Mccain's comparative approach. So the Mccain's approach uses a set of social science tools mainly, such as the history, the culture, religion, and other tools available to analyze a country and then compare to another. So in my case, I'm doing Nigeria. So I'll start with a little bit of background. Nigeria is the most populous African country. It comprises of population of about 200 million people, and it's best described as a third world economy because there are so many problems actually hindering economic growth. So most of these problems can be traced to its history of slavery and colonialism. Then, other than that, a very diverse country with about 250 ethnic groups. Four of those ethnic groups are actually always at the front of political equation since inception, and blessed with vast resources, fertile lands, but corruption remains an institution that keeps hampering economic progress. So let's start with the background. Nigeria was colonized by the British. The British have always sought to colonize Nigeria since as far back as the 18th century. So by 1940, they succeeded in amalgamating the North and South protectorates in Nigeria. They did so without the consent of the indigenes. So that's why some school of thought still argues that Nigeria actually is in an organically formed state. So the reason for the amalgamation was purely for a central control, financial wise, economic wise. So a central control for the British needed a central control they could easily manipulate and exploit. So before the colonization, subsistence agriculture was the bane of the Nigerian economy. So we had families just cultivating mainly food crops, and the excess they trade for other materials or items they may require. But during colonization, this changed to a commercialized form of agriculture. That's the production of cash crops. The major cash crops then were cocoa, palm produce, and granite. So they formed a bulk of the exports. So and most of the present day food crisis in Nigeria could be traced back to colonization. That's the change of attitude from production of food crops to cash crops. So history has it that the period starting colonization was actually coincides with when the British sought out to look for oil all around the globe. So actually, oil wasn't discovered in Nigeria till in commercial quantities, according to OPEC data, until 1956. That's 4 years before independence. Then came independence. Nigeria, so the setting actually changed to a sort of a new colonialism. When I say new colonialism, what I meant is that, yeah, Nigeria gained independence in 1960, but the gained independence in 1960, looking like an independent and sovereign nation, but the political and economic policies are actually being controlled from the outside. So during the period post-independence, economic activities were mainly dominated by expatriates. These expatriates really had the financial muscle to invest in opportunities in Nigeria. So the local investors from that's of Nigerian descent actually couldn't keep up. So what they resorted to most time were they were either intermediaries between the foreign investors and the Nigerian state, or they resorted back to the state for capital. Now, more and more people resorted back to the state for capital. The state more and more got involved in economic activities. So we always had state intervention, and then politics became the only way you could accumulate wealth back then. So you're having a class of individuals that are actually monopolistic. I'm talking about the political class. They are one monopolistic, and they are only after the profits. So, and there were so much ethnic and religious distrust. So this distrust, social distrust, accumulated to accumulated to a civil war just about 7 years after independence. In 1967, Nigeria had the first civil war, the civil war that lasted between 1967 to 1970. So after the civil war, so many deaths were recorded, but after the civil war, the military were actually in power then. So agriculture, in 1974, we had that the contribution of agriculture actually dwindled. Oil became the major contributor to the GDP. So there was oil bloom. So more and more income to the states. So increase in income. But then as income increased, you had an increase in GDP, of course. Then you also had more migrants moving in. Then because agriculture that used to be the pain, the agricultural output had decreased, you're having a situation where inflation arose. Then with inflation, then other than inflation, then we're also having a dearth of industry. When I say death, there's this term they call the Dutch disease. That's the service, the manufacturing, and the production industry actually went a little bit of comatose. Then coupled with financial mismanagement, the economy was actually in a bad state. So we had in 1974, in 1983, we're having the economic policy by President Shehu Shagari. He put in a set of policy to cut down on taxes and to cut down on spending and increase taxes, just so as to reduce budget deficit. So the economy became a little bit more coordinated. Then this coordination persisted even till the regime of the General General Buhari, until the regime of General Ibrahim Babangida, because despite the cut in spending and the raising in taxes, there was no much economic improvement. So you had what they call it, Ibrahim Babangida coming in. He actually applied for MFM loan. In applying for the MFM loan, he had to commit to certain liberal and free market conditions that came with the loan. So this actually brought a little bit of reprieve, but then we have social mobilization and pressure so as to return back to civil Now, the democratic dispensation of Nigeria actually started in 1990, mid 1999. So we had the first president back then, Olusegun Obasanjo. But years of civil rule actually hasn't really changed much. People, the economic indicators are still we didn't really improve from what we had during the military era. And other than that, our economic policy and the political system are actually just copied from foreign lands. So it really doesn't represent what we actually want as people. We just what the political class copied. So we had that, and in spite of the military regime, instead of the military regime being ended, over the course of 23 years of democracy, the civil rule, we still have massive influence from ex-military personnel. This you can clearly see that fact by the you can really see that by the fact that approximately out of 16 years, out of the 23 years of civil rule, were ruled by ex-generals. As we have the ex-general Muritala, the ex-general Olusegun Obasanjo, and President Buhari. So there wasn't much in that regard. But then the civil rule didn't change from the liberal approach of the outgone military area that was committed, the outgone military area committed by General Ibrahim Babangida. But still, there are certain aspects of the economy that are still under managerial, government management. A classic example is the distribution of electricity. Production and distribution of electricity is actually a very coordinated and extractive industry. Now than that, we're having price regulation of petroleum and also the exchange rate regime, the exchange rate regime. These are actually classic examples of government managerial approach to running the economy. So now the Nigeria now on the corruption index 2021, you find that Nigeria is ranking 154 and is the third most corrupt country in the West African region. Now this donates a very informal real sector. Now very informal, and then you're having a tax to GDP ratio of 6%. That is actually the lowest in Africa. Now, on the other end of that spectrum is Tunisia. Tunisia is a country of just 11 million, but having a tax to GDP ratio of about 34%. Then if you are to compare these two countries, you find that on using the prosperity index, if you are to compare this country, you find that Tunisia outranks Nigeria in all indices except for social capital and natural environment, which is just based on Nigeria's land mass and Nigeria's higher population. So that aside, we are having life expectancy. You're looking at life expectancy. The life expectancy in Nigeria is like 54 years, but then in Tunisia it's basically like 74 years or 77 thereabout. Now Nigeria's main export is crude oil. Nigeria produces it's actually the 8th largest oil reserve in the world. So we're having crude oil, but still we are currently having a budget deficit, and we still spend about 7.5 billion importing refined petroleum. Now that points to lack of infrastructural development in terms of building refineries and encouraging local refineries, and as well as corruption. Now, even though Tunisia has a smaller, it's an Tunisia actually is an oil producing state, but it doesn't have as much reserve as Nigeria. But still, the Tunisian rand fares better than the Nigerian naira when you compare it to the USD. That actually shows a more former economic setting. Then you're looking at we also look at the social aspect of the whole of these two systems. We discover that due to ethnic and religious divide, you have more or less more social, more cooperation social wise in Tunisia than Nigeria, because Tunisia is mainly dominantly Muslims. So these are actually one of those things that actually we have to, I would like say, sometimes population isn't all that is required. Sometimes you just actually need people who are willing to look out for each other and then put national interests above their self. So that's how I can decipher on this issue. So I'll thank you for listening. Thank you guys. Ciao.